The Moore Report is brought to you tonight by NSP and in part by the Chiropractic Communication Group.
The fact is, there is a lot of hunger here in Sudan, and if the rains aren't good this year, it's going to really be bad.
Suddenly we have this emergency situation with 250,000 people, maybe 300,000 people turning up in the last 2 or 3 months.
I'd say the biggest problem is that death rates and disease rates are simply out of hand.
We have enough for about another 1,000 vaccines. That's it.
There are serious problems in all the camps with food distribution.
As long as they understand that there is no water for them here, they will have to move to where the water is. They will have no alternative to that.
The big thing, I think, is that, you know, it's all preventable.
Well, it's a real failure of humanity. I think this is how we're going to be judged in the future.
For everything, there is a season. And today, in many parts of Africa, it is a time of famine and misery, of sickness and death. It is a time to weep. It is a tragedy of such enormous scale that it's impossible to imagine. The warnings were sounded years ago, but sadly, few seemed willing to do anything about this looming crisis. The situation has grown steadily worse, so that now millions of African farmers have been reduced to begging refugees. 25 countries on that continent face severe food shortages. It is a human holocaust, a story of such disastrous proportions that we felt that we had to see it for ourselves. And so the documentary crew of reporter Pat Miles, producer Michael Myrendorf, and photographers Jeff Kaufer and David Bowden went to the eastern Sudan, where hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian refugees have fled. The crew spent most of its time in the largest refugee camps, which lie just across the Ethiopian border, where they talked with refugees and the relief workers who are trying to keep them alive. And they tried to answer some basic questions. Who's to blame? What can we do? Can anything be done? They found some answers, and they found much more. It was only after our crew had seen this disaster for themselves that they began to understand that we all must see it too. The scenes may shock or disturb, but we mustn't turn away. We must watch, because this is a personal tragedy of people like ourselves. They have names, they have families, they have dreams for their children. We must watch, because nobody can without starting to care.
They arrive at sunset, sometimes 100, sometimes 1,000. They are Ethiopian refugees, fleeing the war and famine in their country, bringing with them only their clothes, their dignity, their hope for a future. Most of them have walked more than 8 weeks to reach this border camp between Ethiopia and Sudan. As they enter Wad Cowley, their movement is slow, labored. They are tired and hungry.
This camp is completely impossible. It cannot stay here. It's monstrously large. It's probably the largest settlement of humans between Gadaref and Juba. It's almost 100,000 people now, and this is a quite impossible size for a refugee camp.
The refugees are unaware that their journey has brought them out of one hell and into another. They will sit through the night with nothing, waiting to be registered so they can receive their small ration of food. The children are quiet, too dazed, too sick to cry or to care. It is dawn at Wad Cowley. Refugees, still wrapped in blankets from the night's chill, sit huddled by their cooking fires. There is a sense of timelessness here, like a scene with no beginning or end, torn from the scriptures. A grain truck arrives with desperately needed food. Families return from the woods where they've gathered sticks for their fires and their huts. There is no sanitation. Disease and death rates are out of control. People collapse in fields full of human defecation. Sickness and misery are everywhere. Children who were brought here by parents desperate to keep them alive die waiting for someone to help.
50% of the people who are dying, the children who are dying, or 50% of the people who are dying of measles. And we're doing the children who are from 6 to 12 years of age. The reason we're doing them is because 2/3 of those who are dying are of that age and they haven't been vaccinated yet.
15,000 children have been vaccinated at Wad Cowley in the last 2 weeks, but medicine to curb the epidemic is running out.
We have enough for about another 1,000 vaccines. That's it.
Martha Ryan, a nurse from San Francisco, registers and vaccinates children and checks them for malnutrition.
The hardest part of my job is seeing so many children that need so much and not being able to do for them. Because people come in here and they'll ask me to give them a note saying that they could go to the feeding center, but they might be too old, and yet they really do need help. And it's hard to have to turn people away when you know that they all need some help.
I'm going to pass a tube through the nose and into the stomach, and we're going to start feeding the child through that until we get her back to a normal fluid level.
At the camp, there are 2 intensive feeding centers for the most severely malnourished.
All right, there we go. That's nice. Good. Easy, just. Okay. I'm afraid they don't like it, but it is a very effective way of feeding these children.
Many of the children suffer from a number of complications caused by their malnutrition.
There's no elasticity at all in the skin and the stomach. It's a bit like dough, really, when you pull it up, which is a sign of severe dehydration. This child's probably got diarrhea and just hasn't been drinking enough, which is a very, very common problem here. We're getting a lot of children dying from dehydration. And she sounds as if she might have some pneumonia as well.
1,200 children come to the feeding center every day. Between 30 and 40 of them, like this child, may die.
This child has pneumonia, is dehydrated, has very bad dysentery, and is suffering from severe malnutrition.
What kind of chances for life would you give this child?
About, well, less than 50-50.
God must be punishing us because of our bad deeds. But still, we must trust him, because there is no one else to trust.
Tikli is a Christian priest from the Ethiopian village of Geralta. He came to Wad Cowley a month ago with 700 people from his village. After years of drought, there was nothing left there. The land had withered, the cattle had all starved, and the villagers had eaten all their planting seed. And so in desperation, Tikli and his people began a 6-week walk across the desert in search of food. Many of them died on the way. Now, 1/3 of his people are sick. The priest lives in a hut with Alameo, a farmer from Tickley's village. Alameo and his wife Leta Broughton take care of 2 boys whose parents collapsed on the walk to Wad Cowley. They live together in a tiny shelter with 4 other families. Yesterday, Leta Broughton's sister Mindine arrived at the camp with her 3 children. She buried her husband on the way.
He became sick from hunger. He died a week ago. He died on the walk.
In the camp, food is distributed to the village elders. Alameo tells us lately there is only sorghum flour, and some of the flour is mixed with dirt. Camp officials admit that profiteers have tampered with it.
It smells like urine.
Alameo doesn't report the bad flour or complain, afraid there will be no food to eat that night. Even the most miserable things are better than nothing. In a hollowed-out log, Leta Broughton ferments the flour for cooking. Families wait in line at the fire, and because there are no plates, take turns using the same metal sheets to cook the bread. This bread makes my family sick, Alameo says, but we will eat it. We must. We must eat the bread to stay alive. It is our only hope.
We put in 2 measuring sticks over here, and we measure every day the drop in this river, and it's going down now about 2 centimeters every day. When I came here 20 days ago, I could still see, I couldn't see any of these mud tongues leading out into the river, and you can see it going down every day, and it's going down so fast.
At Wad Cowley, the refugees are drinking the river dry. Relief officials estimate the camp needs 200 truckloads of water a day as a bare minimum. There is no way to get that much water into Wad Cowley. The roads are inadequate. There are not enough trucks, not enough fuel. The water that's left in the river can make Alameo's family sick, so he digs a hole in the riverbed to find a less contaminated source. It takes time. Survival requires patience. The refugees are supposed to chlorinate the water before returning home. Many do not. Back in the hut, Alameo shares his water. Minutes later, Mindine's 10-year-old son becomes sick. "Mother," he cries. She looks on helplessly and tries to comfort her son. It will take Alameo an hour to walk 1 mile for the straw he needs to cover the boy's vomit. He is a young man, but his face is deeply lined from years of hunger and worry. For 3 years, he watched his crop slowly dwindle away and his cattle die of starvation. When he is alone, he thinks about his mother who was left behind in Ethiopia, too weak to make the walk to Wad Cowley, and he wonders if she is still alive. They are praying for the resurrection of Christ. They are praying that all they have endured, the hunger, the suffering, and death, will one day pass, and they will live to return to their homes. At Wad Cowley, the grave counter will record 100 deaths today. Refugees who will never make it home. In Ethiopia, plane loads of food from the West arrive every day. But 4 million people in the northern provinces of the country, where the famine and drought are most severe, may never eat even a kernel of the donated grain. They are peasant farmers, most of them, trapped not only by Africa's drought, but by civil war. For 22 years, the central government has been fighting separatist movements in the northern provinces of Tigray and Eritrea. In the midst of the drought, war has driven 500,000 people from their country. Cut off from government aid because they live behind rebel lines, they have been forced to leave their homes in search of food. Thousands who came to government feeding centers for help, many of them rebel supporters, were loaded aboard Soviet planes and flown to resettlement areas in the south. The government claims they were taken to farms. The rebels say the government wants to get the peasants out of the way to make it easier to win the war. Segonia walked out of Eritrea 1 month ago to escape the war. She came to Wad Sharifi, a refugee camp on the eastern border of Sudan. In her hut, she makes coffee and tells us about the fighting and bombing near her village. She tells us she has no place to go now and will stay here. There are 600,000 refugees living in Sudan. 90,000 more arrive each month, and there are reports another 200,000 Ethiopian refugees are on their way and will arrive here by the end of March.
We had advance warning that things were getting bad in August, and of course there were people starting to trickle in as recently as, or as long ago as 2 years ago. But the real massive influxes began between August and October, and by October we were in a crisis situation.
At Wad Sharifi, the refugee camp where Segonia lives, the population went from 5,000 to 75,000 people in less than 2 months. At one point, the camp simply ran out of food and water. The Swiss Red Cross, the only medical team at the camp, could not control the death rates. Doctors and nurses, unable to help medically, tried instead to get food.
And the people was coming and nothing, no food at all was coming at all.
Josephine, a nurse with the Swiss Red Cross, remembers children collapsing and dying, 30 at a time, in her feeding center.
Well, it just was thousands of people with no food and no water.
Along the border in the new reception centers, we're probably losing close to 1,000 people a week. And this is just unacceptable from all of our points of view.
Fred Cooney and his company were hired by the United Nations to manage the crisis at the refugee camps in eastern Sudan. Cooney developed plans for the camps at Wad Sharifi and Wad Cowley to move the refugees to new settlements and to redirect the work of the volunteer agencies. At a meeting, Cooney made it clear he was not happy with the way things had been going.
And if we're not ahead of the situation now, if we get hit with another 100,000, we're just going to be so far behind, a lot of people are going to die.
The Swiss Red Cross complained it could no longer handle the numbers of refugees flooding the camp at Wad Sharifi. They asked for help. Cooney and the UN responded by sending a medical team to the camp from a Denver-based relief organization called La Lumba. The team will eventually build a medical shelter there, but for now its mission is setting up an intensive feeding center for the most malnourished children at Wad Sharifi.
Could we get 20 bags of DSM and 200 kilos of sugar? That's what we'd like to get.
Yeah, no problem.
The team has come to Wad Sharifi with only a few days' notice and no supplies. John Benson, a nurse with the group, is rushing to get organized by borrowing food and materials from the Red Cross. Each small task will take Benson hours. No one hurries in Sudan.
We're in a place of Inshallah, Mumkin, and Bokra in Malesh. That's God willing, maybe, tomorrow, and what can you do? For a while, Malesh used to bug me because it meant, you know, and you couldn't tell the difference between somebody saying, well, what the hell, and saying, what can we do?
At the camp, the team's feeding center is going up in record time.
But what jobs did you have before?
But there are other problems, finding people who can speak English and at least 4 different local languages to communicate with all the refugees.
What languages do you have?
10th grade.
But what languages do you have? No. Which languages do you speak?
I can speak English, Amharic, Tigray, and Tigrinya.
Where's our guy that's going ahead to get people together?
Dr. Wes Sowers is trying to find refugees who can help him administer medical care at the camp.
So what number should be here? How many are under 150?
He is tough, dedicated, but with no illusions about the job, trying to be patient while rushing to get organized. Language problems and the fear of the refugees, most of whom have never seen a white person, make each task, like measuring a child to see if he needs extra food, tedious and frustrating.
Start it right here, okay? Come around like this, okay?
Sowers, who has been in Africa over a year, agreed to stay on another 6 months to open the team's clinic at Wad Sharifi.
I think what we're going to have to do is just change how we're doing this and get the kids that are at home and send them in and not worry about the statistics so much.
So I said to the whole group that tomorrow they have to stay at their homes and then we can do the survey exactly.
So we can't do the survey 2 months ago, Gertz Egermont was a tourist passing through Sudan.
But that's why I want to start painting, because that's something practical. We can do that now.
The team asked him to stay and help them do a nutrition survey. Gertz, who brought only 2 shirts and a pair of jeans with him to Sudan, agreed.
Let's move. I looked 1 year to go to an agency to find a job as a volunteer somewhere in a country. And they said, well, we only need nurses and doctors. So I am a social worker, but then I arrived here as a tourist and suddenly they say they needed someone to do a survey. They couldn't find anyone. So I said, well, I can stay here for a while. And so I got involved in the whole thing.
The paint will be used to number the refugee huts. It's the only way for Gertz to keep track of the children who come to the feeding center. He is looking for someone to help number the huts.
Paint number 4. Paint it. Paint 4.
Gertz is impatient, sometimes frantic. Children are dying, he tells us, and I can do something about it.
0 Wahed, okay? Wahed. If you go to the second one, you start again. H 1 0 2.
By the end of the day, Gertz and his ragged team will number almost 1,200 huts.
When we have the children coming for the feeding program, we will have this number, and if they don't come for a certain period of time, we know where to go to find out why and what's happened to them, if they're sick and can't come or what.
Sister Terry Shields, a nun from Pennsylvania. She came back to Africa after she saw pictures of the starving refugees on the news. She packed up and joined the team in Sudan to help organize its new feeding center.
Tomorrow will be identification, really, of how bad the kids, what the situation is nutritionally. We'll do a rough screening on them, and the children that are moderately bad will be given supplementary feeding. The kids that are really bad will have therapeutic feeding.
Okay, so now the way to do it, though, is put in a little, and then mix it, and then a little more, and mix it, and then a little...
Laura Benson is used to accomplishing small miracles. She's worked in Africa for 2 years, put together feeding centers for malnourished children at other refugee camps, but none so large or desperate as Wad Sharifi.
We're going to start making 500 liters of milk a day.
In only a few days, the team has built a shelter where thousands of starving children will be able to get food. They have worked around the clock to get it done quickly, spending many frustrating hours on the small details like wiring mats, mixing food, finding water, and hiring enough help to make it all work.
Yeah.
I think so.
All we need are customers.
And now, finally, the job is finished.
Are you surprised you were able to get it together this quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really... Monday there was nothing here. I think so. I'm surprised.
They are 5 people who came to Sudan to make a difference. Tomorrow, when they open their feeding center, they will.
Come tomorrow.
Like hundreds of other children here, Hisson has become a master at suffering. Since birth, he has been dying by inches. Now, there is nothing left.
Totally malnourished. Lack of food, lack of protein, lack of calorie. This is just because of not enough food. Just of anything at all. 7.5. Here, 7.5. 7.5. How old is that child? 8. 4 years. Look, a child of 1 meter of 100 should weigh normally more than 13 kilos. This weight only 7.5. So 7.5. It is not even on our chart. It's less than 50% maybe. Our chart is only going till 60%.
Hisson has grown old waiting for someone to help. He was born 4 years ago, the same year the world was warned of critical food shortages in Africa. And now, it may be too late, even with food, to save his life.
People will say, what's it like? And you'll tell them a few things, and then conversation changes. It's hard to explain to people. It's hard to explain to yourself, too. And, you know, when you see this and try to figure out why.
The system, unfortunately, is designed to react to the starving child rather than keeping the child from starving. And the system didn't react the way it could have reacted, and it certainly didn't react the way it should have reacted. We waited for a long time to deal with people, even though we knew they were on the move. There were accurate reports coming out about what the numbers might be. As far as the UN system is concerned, there were some pretty massive failures in predicting and anticipating needs of moving supplies in.
They have been waiting, some of them for days, for food, a ration with only enough calories to keep a human being alive.
We came with our parents from our village, and we wait in this place 6 days. We haven't any food.
It is 110 degrees. They are too weak to push or shove in the line. There are police and thorn bushes to restrain them. They were once proud farmers. Now they live on 3 cups of grain, a half cup of oil, and some beans. Emergency airlifts bringing oil and beans to Wad Sharifi, where food is running out, have arrived. Water supplies are being trucked in, but still not enough to support the 75,000 refugees who are already at the camp and the thousands more who are on their way. The problems became critical last year when huge numbers of refugees from Ethiopia began pouring into eastern Sudan. There had been warnings they were on the way, but no one was prepared. The UN, the relief agencies, the Sudanese government were all overwhelmed.
There are things that could have been done better, that we ran out of food. Now, we did everything we could do to try and avoid this, but when you run out of food, people really suffer. You see the nutritional status declining of people who were in a bad way when they came in, but would have been all right if they got food quickly.
At Wad Sharifi, medical workers were left to fight diseases that could have been prevented if only minimal amounts of food had been provided to the refugees.
You know scurvy?
What causes scurvy, doctor?
Lack of vitamin C.
He was so weak and had such apathy that he couldn't eat at all.
There are some successes, but they are rare. Doctors call this 5-year-old boy a miracle child because he lived.
Most of the children that were in his that shape when they came in died very shortly afterwards, usually of pneumonia or of diarrhea.
So he was just lucky.
Yeah.
Just meant to live.
Yeah.
Relief workers struggle to do basic medicine. In their clinics, refugees die every day of ailments like diarrhea and measles that could be easily cured if their patients weren't starving.
The camps are too large. We have settlements now that the two main reception centers are pushing between them 160,000 people. And the sites are not adequate to support them. The agencies there are overworked. They're not able to get ahead of the operation, and it's been a real problem.
Recently, the United Nations hired Fred Cooney and his company to manage the crisis in Sudan. When he was asked to come, Cooney, a Texan, grabbed his boots, shipped his plane, and went to work trying to untangle the mess.
Okay, this is Fowl 1. This is the original site of the camp plant here with all the tents in it. The fact is that, you know, we're the consumers of the world's resources. We're the ones that are contributing a lot to the underdevelopment just by the use of resources. And that makes it incumbent on us to also try and find solutions for some of the problems out here.
These kids look okay. Obviously got cases of worms and some of the basic things you'd expect to see, but right now most of them look in pretty good shape. Let's take a look at the little one over here. Hello. Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm no medical person, but I'd say overall these look okay.
Cooney is touring FAO, one of the refugee camps he helped plan. 50,000 refugees were trucked here recently from the eastern border of Sudan. At FAO, the United Nations has provided tents. The camp is located next to a canal, so there is water, and the International Rescue Committee has set up medical clinics. The camp is considered a model for future refugee settlements in Sudan, and eventually all of the refugees from Wad Sharifi and Wad Cowley will be trucked to similar places.
I think that everybody has been concerned with the question of site selection, of finding somewhere for the people to go. But I think, you know, I would not wish to criticize the Sudanese, because this is a problem that is on top of a very severe Sudanese problem.
Last night, 2,000 refugees at Wad Sharifi were told they would be trucked to a new camp. But no one here has received any food yet, and there is reluctance about leaving the border area, where from the camp they can see the mountains of their homeland.
People are sick and tired. Some people couldn't even make it here. We who have come should not be separated. We are too tired to be moved.
Do they have any choice but to go?
We don't think we can make it to a new camp. We are too weak. It's all the same for us. It's better for us to die here.
The Sudanese are in a hurry to move the refugees. Not only are resources running out at Wad Sharifi, the people are living on Sudanese cropland, and the farmers want them off. "10,000 of the Wad Sharifi refugees are being trucked to this new camp at Gerba. It is located near a small Sudanese village and a reservoir. Several miles away, other camps are being built for the refugees at Wad Cowley. For Sudan, a country facing its 5th year of drought, the implications of supporting these refugees from Ethiopia are enormous.
The borders remain open, but privately Sudanese officials are beginning to despair. The government is bankrupt. To the south, there is civil war. Already in the cities, gas is being rationed, and in these villages, many foods are scarce.
20 miles outside the capital, Khartoum, thousands of Sudanese farmers are living as refugees in their own country. Of all the refugee camps we saw in Sudan, this one appeared the most chaotic, the most violent. Children fought over bread. and whips were used to keep people in order.
In a way, there's a balance. You can't just concentrate on the east alone, where the problems are perhaps the most serious, but one has to try and keep an overview, because the Sudan is a country that is facing refugee problems on 3 of the 4 points of the compass.
25 African nations now face critical food shortages because of drought, primitive farming techniques, and the continuing deforestation of the land by man and animals. The land is simply drying up and blowing away.
There's been some talk, too, even of the Nile being covered with, of the northern part just being covered over with sand, which would stop the flow of the Nile. The U.S. and Sudanese can't afford to let it blow away. There's been lots of discussion, lots of talk. There's lots of ideas.
But not much action. The desert in Africa advances 6 miles each year, and it will take billions of dollars to begin to reverse the process.
I think it may be over the next 20 years there will be major demographic changes in population changes in Africa, and it may be that Africa will end up at the end of it with a very much smaller population than it has at the moment.
On his farm in the Sudanese village of El Azaza, Mohammed is worried about the future. For 2 years he hasn't had a crop. All his livestock died of starvation, and his sons have been sent to the nearest town to work as day laborers. Because he sold his plows and oxen, next year he will plant by hand. It will take him 6 weeks. What will he do, we ask him, if it doesn't rain? We will pray, he tells us. We will pray.
We'd like to give you an update now on the situation at the refugee camps in eastern Sudan. The latest information we have received is that the relief efforts there are making some progress. At Wad Cowley, the death rates are down, and the measles epidemic is now under control with the arrival of more vaccine. But the refugees must be moved from that camp to a new site because the water has now run out, and officials cannot continue to truck water into Wad Cowley. At Wad Sharifi, the Lalumba team has now been joined by some of the volunteers from the Minnesota-based American Refugee Committee. Together, they will provide medical care and nutritional feeding at the camp. By the 1st of April, they hope to have a permanent medical clinic and also a feeding center set up and in operation. We also have reports that another 200,000 people from Ethiopia are now walking toward eastern Sudan, and that 20,000 have already reached the border area and are entering the country now. With us this evening, we have asked 4 people to join us who have been to Africa and know firsthand the problems of the Ethiopian refugees. They have joined us tonight for a panel discussion, and I would like to introduce them. They are Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Marlene Johnson, who returned from a visit to eastern Sudan a month ago. Since that time, she has been actively involved in raising funds for the relief effort. Also with us tonight is Ron Way, Director of the American Refugee Committee in Minnesota. He toured eastern Sudan with Lieutenant Governor Johnson and recently helped to organize a medical team now working at Wad Sharifi. Also, Dr. Tesfahum Berhe is from Eritrea. He lives in Minneapolis and works as an assistant professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Berhe has worked extensively with the Eritrean Relief Committee to get food into the Ethiopian province of Eritrea. And also with us tonight is Dan Canal, Executive Director of Grassroots International, a relief organization that contributes aid directly to the people in Eritrea and Tigray. Dan is a research fellow at the African Studies Center at Boston University. Thank all of you very much for being with us tonight. We're going to be back to begin our panel discussion in just a moment. Thank you for joining us tonight for our panel discussion. Let me just quickly introduce again Lieutenant Governor Johnson, Dr. Berhe, Dan Canal, and also Ron Way of the American Refugee Committee. People are so concerned about if their contributions are getting to the refugee camps and if they are helping people there. There are conflicting reports all of the time about what is and is not reaching the refugees. I wonder if you could address that, Ron. You have a medical team there. I'm sure you get reports back.
The supplies are getting through. Our people are working. Some of these reports, I think, are confusing the situation in Ethiopia with eastern Sudan. Eastern Sudan is a manageable situation, and the supplies are getting through.
The real problem, Pat, is that the supplies aren't getting into the heartland of Ethiopia, where both war and drought are causing this problem, so that the people have to leave to come into the Sudan to get food. I think the Sudanese are cooperating incredibly well with the agencies to make sure that the aid works. But the people have to get the aid in their home villages so they don't get out there in the first place.
In other words, they're not getting help until they are, in fact, a refugee.
And in a certain sense, because of the situation in Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government's policies, we're creating refugees by trying to help them and compounding the problem.
Mm-hmm. Why is it, Marlene, that the situation has become as critical? Aren't there developmental programs that governments couldn't do to help this, to prevent the situation from being the way it is in the first place?
Well, I think there are two issues. I mean, the issue of development and how we approach development is a difficult one, and in my view, we haven't been very appropriate in that. I mean, a typical power plant paid for by USAID doesn't make much sense in a country where farmers need $50 loans and maybe an upgrade in tools and some technical assistance. But the other issue is that the crisis now is really compounded because of drought. And so while we have to look at long-term issues, we really have to address the emergency at the moment, and that emergency is today and tomorrow and next month and 6 months from now for the next year or two. And it's not going away, it's only going to get worse. And the contributions of Minnesotans and all Americans and the world community just must continue. Our contribution this week isn't enough. It's only enough for today.
Mm-hmm. Why is it, and we mentioned this in our report, that 4 years ago, when the word was first out that Africa was in trouble, that there were people, in fact, facing critical food shortages, why is it that at that point no one cared, no one contributed?
Well, when we are talking about the people who are hit by this drought, there are two kinds of population. One group is the one who have crossed the border to the Sudan, who are the strongest, who could make it there, which we have seen on channel for WCCO-TV. The others are the ones who are dispersed in the valleys and caves in Eritrea and in Tigray, in the northern part of Ethiopia. Now, those people are suffering, and the aid is not penetrating, as Dan was saying, deep to the countryside. Now, there are some relief organizations who are working inside those areas. For example, if we take the case of the Eritrean situation, we have the Eritrean Relief Association. Its headquarters is in the Sudan, and what they do is whatever they get supply from Port Sudan, they have few trucks, they take it all the way to the mainland of Eritrea to reach the people. The idea is to contain the people till this situation improves. But this problem has been more than 10 years. And in our organization, the Eritrean Relief Association, has been operating since 1975. So anything goes in cooperation with the government through the relief organizations is not reaching the needy people. Mm-hmm. This is the main problem. The other problem is they are simply transporting people from markets and from relief delivery areas to the southern part, to the Oromo land, without any planning. Those people who come there just came to get some grain from the distribution centers. Without any planning, they simply pick them from the distribution area, load them in planes, and take them south to settle them. And that is not the way that should be done. So the problem is very massive. There is no solution for it so far. We haven't seen any infrastructure going on in Ethiopia, whereas there are small cottage industries setting up in Eritrea. And in Eritrea, at this particular time, the Lutheran World Relief is working, the United Methodist of Christ, the United Methodist of America, the Direct Relief International are participating, and also Dan's organization is participating in reaching the Eritrean people and the Tigrayan people.
Pat, you know, you said, though, in the beginning that it wasn't a story 4 years ago. I think we have a real question to ask ourselves, and I think the public needs to address this. Prevention of a disaster was not a story. When we saw it coming, it really, I think we have to face it, it wasn't a story until network television went in and saw people dying by the hundreds per day. Now we know that's the case. We know that it's spreading in Africa. What are we going to do? Are we going to stay with this tomorrow, or will we shift somewhere else? I have to commend your interest in doing this, but the public also has to say, okay, we have a warning here. This is a continent in crisis. Are we going to take this opportunity now and really move in the long term to try to make it easier for these people to live, to produce for themselves, or are we going to help them today and then turn somewhere else tomorrow?
But isn't it true, Dan, that there's a fundamental problem with relief agencies in that they rely on appeals from the public, and that appeals from the public are generally not successful until people see a starving child or a refugee who's had to leave his home?
Well, I think there are two issues here, though. I mean, one is private contributions to the relief organizations, and the other is government policy. And the two have to go hand in hand. Neither would be or is enough right now in East Africa. We have to have substantial government aid, financial aid and development aid, and we also need to have ongoing support by these organizations. And most of the private organizations, from Lutheran World Relief to Catholic Relief to ARC, to grassroots, I mean, they do fundraising all the time, ongoing. And the issue is whether or not we, as a people, are going to decide that we're not going to let this one go.
Well, we have a responsibility in here, too. I think it's not enough to say, this is the popular issue, let's go raise funds for it. We have to educate the public. We have to make a commitment. Yeah. The agencies themselves, we who are on the ground and who see this, I think, we're not going to resolve the problem over there. Grassroots International is a drop in the bucket compared to what's necessary. The real value that we and the ARC and others like us have is that we're there with the people. We know what's needed, and then we have to come out to the media and to the government agencies and say, look, here's what's needed. We know how to see it used productively, but you're going to have to come up with the big bucks. You're going to have to come out with the money.
What about the future? The problem seems so overwhelming when you see it firsthand, and you wonder, what can we do really? I mean, will our contributions make a difference, and will that ultimately result in those people being able to return to their homes and somehow building back their culture and their country?
Pat, I think we have to keep in mind that, yes, the problem is going to get worse before it gets better. No, it is not hopeless. If we look at it that way, I think then it's easy to turn tail and run. But the process of education is starting. The process must continue, but most important, I think, is we've got to commit to working there for the long term. We'll deal with the crisis, and we're doing that. Haphazard as it may be, it's at least happening. But now we've got to take it the next step and commit to working long term to solve this problem. Yeah, I think it's solvable, but it takes commitment.
I also was very affected, as we all were, by seeing the death and the suffering there. And it's extraordinary to see somebody starve to death. But side by side, I came back with a tremendous inspiration at watching the people there affected in Eritrea, in Tigray, the Eritreans and Tigrayans, not the outsiders, but they themselves organizing to care for their own, anxious with an enormous amount of dignity, anxious to get back to work, to get out of a charitable situation. And if they can find hope in a situation as bad as that, I think we can't do any less.
That was one of the amazing things, because in the face of everything, they have so much of their humanity intact. And
their spirit is not broken.
No, not at all. Not at all.
It is like anything else we do. We can only take it one step at a time. Each of us can only do what we can do today. And the overwhelming aspects cannot be the excuse for not taking action today. And I think that's what we're all saying in our own way, that we find our own peace, whether it's educating ourselves today or sharing what we've come to understand from having been there with others, whether it's giving money today or raising money tomorrow, whatever it is, every day there is something we can do, and we just have to get about the business of doing what each of us can do today, and then tomorrow we do work on what we can do tomorrow.
At this particular time, while I have the opportunity, I would like to appreciate what you have been doing in the name of the Eritrean people and the Tigrayan people. Now, this problem could be solved. There is nothing that could not be solved if people coordinate their things. There was drought in Israel The land was desert. There was drought in India. That has been reversed. There is a big lesson there. What we are, the main problem is how to direct the fund, how the big fundraising organizations should direct the funds they raise to the needy and to solving the problem, because there are only few of them who are penetrating deep where the needy are. That is the main problem. And the American public has been very responsive and kind. I have been on a hotline which was set up by WCCO, and the people were telling me, I'm on a fixed income, and I wanted to make a little check, to send a little check today, a little check later. But I would like to know where my money goes. And they have the right to know. So the big fundraising organizations like Save the Children, like World Vision, like the Catholic Charity, they have to really understand and follow the example of the Lutheran World Relief, the United Methodist of Christ, the Direct Relief International, what they are doing. We have to educate ourselves. First, those of us who are raising funds have to understand the root cause of the problem, what the immediate need is, and what the future is. If we understand that, and if we bring that back again to the American people, they will always respond.
Dr. Berhe, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being with us. We want to close tonight with sort of a personal diary. So many people have asked me since the trip to Sudan and the refugee camps, what was it really like? It's been a difficult question to answer. Life there is so unlike anything that we know, and there is so much to tell. But in an effort to explain what it was like covering this story, I put together some personal photographs and also some thoughts from the trip.
We are in a third world country, a place where most people have never known what it was like to have enough food. The things we take for granted, like water to bathe and wash our clothes, are precious to them. People walk for days with their donkeys to bring 2 bags of water back to their huts. In Sudan, most people travel by donkey and camel. Fuel for vehicles is almost impossible to find. We purchased our own gasoline at $10 a gallon on the black market and carried it on top of our Land Rover. There is only one highway through the entire country. To reach the refugee camps, we traveled over hundreds of miles of unpaved desert. We found food for ourselves in the villages, but in the camps we were at the mercy of relief organizations. The International Rescue Committee and others shared their food with us, and when there was room, offered us a hut to sleep inside. Other nights we slept on mats outside and felt extraordinarily lucky to have such comfort. It was a sad trip. There is so much misery in the refugee camps. We saw suffering and dying, and we cried as parents buried their children. We ached for all of these people living now in the dirt, huddled under tiny shelters made of sticks and straw, and for their helpless animals, tied and left to die without food or water. In the camps, people followed us everywhere, begging for food, water, blankets, and medicine for their children. "We'll tell your story," we told them, and they looked at us desperately, not knowing anything about television or cameras, knowing only that today they needed someone to help them. We went to Sudan to cover a story, but we came back with much more. We came back with a deep commitment to the refugees we came to know there, and they taught us many lessons about life and about hope. And on the days we felt most helpless and most hopeless, they cheered us up. They showed us that life is precious, that dreams are important, and that we mustn't, for them, lose faith, that someday their future will be brighter.
2 weeks ago, WCCO broadcast a series of special cover stories about the African famine. One of our reviewers was 7-year-old Tim Olson. According to Tim's mother, right after the news, Tim rushed to his room and returned with his piggy bank, and he said, "I want to send this to the refugees." Well, his mother reminded him that the family was going to San Francisco in a couple of weeks for a vacation, asked him if he didn't want to save his money for that. Well, Tim thought for a moment, and then he wrote us this letter. "I have saved my allowance and decided that the people in Africa need it more than I do. I hope this will help." And in the envelope were 2 $5 bills and a penny. Thanks, Tim. If you want information on how to help, you may call the African Relief Hotline, where volunteers are waiting to answer questions about contributions. The number is 612-888-3888. 3119. You may call collect. Since the hotline was open 2 weeks ago, volunteers have taken over 4,000 calls. To everything, there is a season, a time to weep, and now, a time to help. I'm Dave Moore. Good night.
Tonight we begin a week-long series of cover stories on a part of the world that has too little food to feed thousands of its people. For 3 weeks, Pat Miles and a WCCO news crew traveled to East Africa, specifically in the refugee camps on the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. Victims of a famine have fled there from Ethiopia, specifically from the provinces of Eritrea and Tigray. Pat Miles joins us now tonight to begin her reports. Pat?
Thanks, Mike. It was not what we imagined. In fact, it was much worse. It is impossible to tell you exactly what we saw or how we felt. There is nothing in our own lives to compare with it. It is truly one of the worst human tragedies of our time. You cannot escape the misery and the death. Here in Wad Cowley, a refugee camp on the border between Ethiopia and Sudan, it seems the funeral processions never end. This man led his family out of Ethiopia. For 8 weeks they walked, looking for food. Today, he buries his son. The numbers numb your mind. 1,000 refugees die each week, most of them children. Children so malnourished, they must be forced to eat.
All right, there you go. That's good. Easy just. Okay, I'm afraid they don't like it, but it is a very effective way of feeding these children.
This supplemental feeding program has been set up for the most severe cases.
There's no elasticity at all in the skin and the stomach. It's a bit like dough, really, when you pull it up, which is a sign of severe dehydration. This child's probably got diarrhea and just hasn't been drinking enough, which is a very, very common problem here. We're getting a lot of children dying from dehydration.
90% of the refugees at Wad Cowley have dysentery. Many of them drink contaminated water out of a dried-up riverbed. There is no sanitation. People too weak to walk collapse in fields full of human defecation. The disease and death rates are out of control, and still the refugees come to these camps in Sudan, 5,000 people each day. It is a final act of desperation by people who have been slowly starving to death over the last 4 years. They are farmers whose land has dried up. They have eaten all their planting seed and their livestock, given up hope for rain. But famine is not the only reason for this exodus. Theirs is a land besieged by war. For over 20 years, the central government of Ethiopia has fought separatist movements in the provinces of Tigray and Eritrea. And because of the conflict, these people who lived behind rebel lines were cut off from the emergency food aid reaching Ethiopia. He tells us, "I am tired, I am sick, I am hungry." They walk on 2 major refugee trails leading out of Ethiopia. One ends here at Wad Cowley, where there are now 92,000 people. The other leads to Wad Sharifi. 75,000 refugees have fled here over the last 3 months. 4-year-old Hissan is one of them.
What are you seeing here?
Totally malnourished. Lack of food, lack of protein, lack of calorie. This is just because of not enough food. Just of anything at all. 7.5. Here, 7.5. 7.5.
7.5.
How old is that child?
8.
4 years. A child of 1 meter of 100 should weigh normally more than 13 kilos. This weight only 7.5. So 7.5. It is not even on our chart. It's less than 50% maybe. Our chart is only going to 60%.
Hisson was born in Eritrea. He was born 4 years ago, the same year there were warnings of the severe food shortage facing 17 African nations. Now, 4 years later, Hisson is a starving refugee, and 9 more African countries have critical food shortages.
It's going to get worse before it gets better, and unfortunately, that's just the way it's going to be. You know, more money is needed, and certainly a lot more resources of all types. And you know, until we can develop really comprehensive way of dealing with Africa and this region, until we can get some peace across the borders, we're going to see a lot more of it.
The food lines at Wad Sharifi move slowly, if at all. Refugees line up at dawn and sit for hours in 110-degree heat, waiting for 3 cups of grain, 1/2 cup of cooking oil, and some beans. It is their ration for the day. They are kept back by police and thorn bushes.
Are some of these people turned away then at the end of the day when you close?
Yes.
How can they get food?
And the next time, the next day.
For 6 days, these men have been waiting.
We came with our parents from our village, and we wait in this place 6 days. We haven't any food.
3,500 new refugees arrive at Wad Sharifi each week, too many for the camp, where there are already critical food shortages. In the Sudanese villages near the camp, farmers complain about the refugees living on their cropland. From all sides, there is pressure now to move the refugees to other camps.
The people in this section were told last night to be ready this morning to be trucked out, and many of them refused. It was a pitiful protest and one that resulted in their huts being torn down and burned. For these newcomers, it was a lesson every refugee learns early, that for them, there is no home.
Sudanese officials finally resorted to kicking down the huts, irritated by all the delays. As the trucks were being loaded, refugees gathered around us, asking for help.
If the situation is like this, if they don't give us food here, we don't expect anything outside of here. It's better for us to die here.
Ask them if they wish they had never come.
We regret that we have come. We thought the solution was to come here. We came for the help of the Red Cross, but they didn't do anything for us. We are hopeless now.
Many of the refugees at both Wad Sharifi and Wad Cowley are being relocated now at new camps, camps selected by the United Nations Refugee Committee and Sudanese officials. But the new camps are located farther from the border of Ethiopia. The refugees will no longer be able to see the mountains of their homeland. And with each passing mile, their hopes for returning seem as dry and empty as this desert.
If you'd like to help, WCCO Television and 22 famine relief agencies have set up the African Relief Hotline. The number is 888-3119. You can get information on how to contribute to this critical relief effort in Africa. Operators are standing by. You may call collect if you live outstate. Tomorrow night, the story of a family who left Ethiopia and walked 6 weeks to a refugee camp in eastern Sudan. On the way, 3 family members died, too sick, too starved to make the journey. The family shared their story with us.
Tonight, as you have already undoubtedly noticed, we welcome Pat Miles back to the 10 p.m. report. Pat's been in Africa, and tonight she offers part 2 in her series of reports on the suffering.
Thank
Pat?
you, Dave. It's very good to be back, by the way. Well, for months now, we have seen the images of the starving drought victims in Africa. The pictures shock us, the endless faces of such emaciated people. But often we forget that these people have names, they have homes, and they have families. They are Christians here at the Wadcali refugee camp. Their Coptic priests chant an ancient prayer for the resurrection of Christ. They wonder, though, about their own salvation. God must be punishing us, a priest says. Even though God takes our life, we must accept what happens. Tikli was a priest in Gibraltar, a small Ethiopian village 6 weeks' walk from here. He came 1 month ago with most of his village, and now he takes care of his people in the camp. As he leads us on a tour of his Wadcali settlement, he tells us that 2/3 of his people are sick with measles, dysentery, and malaria. Half of them are severely malnourished or too sick to eat. Lately, much of Tickle's time is spent on burials. Today, the grave counter will record 100 deaths. The priest takes us to a hut where he sleeps with 3 other families, all from Gibraltar. The camp is crowded, 7 times worse than minimum standards set by the World Health Organization. Here we meet Alamejo, a farmer who seems to be the head of this makeshift household. He has come with Leta Broughton, his wife of 25 years. They've adopted Alamejo's 2 nephews whose parents died of starvation on the walk from Ethiopia. Yesterday, they were joined by Leta Broughton's sister Mindine and her 3 children. Mindine is weak. She has no milk for her baby. It has taken them a month to walk here, and now her other children are sick. Her husband is dead.
He became sick from hunger. He has died a week ago. He died on the walk.
The 3rd family comes from the same village, but they are not related. Imbravasu came with her husband and his brother. She has 2 children. The families share the work of survival. Leta Broughton prepares a paste of sorghum flour that the families ferment in a hollowed-out log. They have no other place to store their food. Imbravasu has just gotten her turn at the cooking fire, which is shared by several other households. There is a shortage of metal plates to cook the bread. Alamejo and his family have no food other than the sorghum bread. He tells us that his adopted son Kiros has trouble swallowing the bread and that it makes him sick. Camp officials admit that some flour is adulterated. Someone mixed it with dirt.
The bread that we do get, we can't eat. It's just no good. But we must eat it in order to stay alive. It's our only choice.
The biggest problem facing the refugees at Wadcali is water. Their only source is a small pool in a dried-up riverbed that borders the camp. Little more than a week's supply remains. Alamejo, Kiros, and Imbravasu's brother have come to fill their small plastic bottles before the day gets too hot. The water seeps slowly into a hole they have dug in the riverbed. Survival requires patience. The refugees are supposed to chlorinate their water before returning home. Many do not. Back in the hut, Alamejo shares his water. Minutes later, Mindine's 10-year-old son becomes sick. Mother, he cries. She looks on helplessly and tries to comfort her son.
There is little medicine at Wad Cowley. A 29-bed field hospital serves over 90,000 people. The families have nothing to clean up the vomit, so Alameo walks to a place a mile outside the camp where he can gather straw. When he is alone, he tells us he often thinks of his home in Ethiopia. Alameo was once a successful farmer with 10 parcels of land, but after the drought began, his crops dwindled steadily. Last year, there was no harvest at all. He sold his cattle and began eating seed grain. There was no choice. We asked Alameo if he would have come to Wad Cowley if he'd known what it was going to be like.
It's all death for us. Whether we are in our homeland or in the camp, it's all death.
Early in the evening, after we left Alameo, 700 new arrivals came to Wad Cowley.
We had word tonight with the telex that Wad Cowley has now run out of water. 4 days ago it happened, and the new arrivals have increased to 1,000 people a day. Relief agencies are trying to truck water to the camp and relocate some of the refugees, but they can't keep up with the numbers. It's reported that over 100,000 people will arrive in those camps over the next few months. WCCO Television has joined 24 relief agencies in setting up a hotline number to help these people. And for more information, you may call 612-888-3119. Operators are on duty from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m., and you may call collect if you live out state. People who want to help the Ethiopian refugees have asked us all week if their money is getting there, if the relief effort is working. After 3 weeks in Sudan, living with the refugees and the volunteers, we can tell you that yes, your contributions are helping, but also that more money is needed. Last month, there wasn't enough food for all the refugees in Sudan. Those who arrived at Wad Cowley, already weakened by their journey and years of famine in Ethiopia, thought there would be something to eat and drink here. Many of them sat for days with nothing, quietly despairing as their strength slipped away. The problems began mounting last year when huge numbers of refugees from Ethiopia poured into eastern Sudan. There had been warnings they were coming, but no one was prepared. The relief agencies were caught short and overwhelmed by the masses of people.
Obviously, what's personally very frustrating is that we have not been able to keep ahead of the problem, that there are things that could have been done better, that we ran out of food. Now, we did everything we could do to try and avoid this, but when you run out of food, people really suffer. And you see the nutritional status declining of people who were in a bad way when they came in, but would have been all right if they got food quickly.
The United Nations put out appeals. Emergency shipments and airlifts of food have finally arrived, but still not enough to keep up with the numbers. The refugees are given only enough food to keep them alive. And while nations have responded to the crisis, sometimes their gestures have caused other complications. These plastic tents were donated by a relief agency whose officials didn't realize there were bone-chilling desert winds at the refugee camp at El Fau. They will be taken down and stored, like the boxes of spaghetti from Italy, where someone forgot there was a shortage of water here. And most of the grain delivered to Wad Cowley comes unmilled.
What's happened is a few enterprising refugees, as well as some of the local Sudanese, have moved in and set up milling facilities, and people have to give their food as payment for milling. So if they're getting a ration of, say, 450 grams, they may have to give up as much as a quarter of it to the millers.
There are other problems with the flour. Some of it is contaminated. There are reports of sacks half emptied and filled with dirt or rotted, fermented flour.
It smells like urine.
A lot of the food disappears. Contractors that are paid to deliver the food divert it. Others sandbag it. Some of the food's tampered with between the time it leaves the port and the time it arrives in the camp.
The refugees don't report the bad flour or turn it in, afraid they'll have nothing else to eat that night. Because of food shortages, some refugees get nothing more than grain to eat. Their diet is so nutritionally deficient, many of the children are going blind from lack of vitamin A. Medical workers fight diseases they know could be prevented if the refugees were given only minimal amounts of the right foods.
You know scurvy?
What causes scurvy, doctor?
Lack of vitamin C.
In every camp, there are epidemics of diseases caused by hygiene and sanitation problems. At Wad Cowley, 50% of the children who are dying of measles, and medicine for vaccinations, like food, is in short supply.
We're going to run out very shortly. In fact, we ran out earlier, about a week ago we ran out, and we just got another supply, and now that's why we're able to do these older children. But we are running out. We have enough for about another 1,000 vaccines. That's it.
Equipment for tube feeding the most malnourished children is wearing out faster than doctors can replace it.
We've got basic medicines, but we have got very little variety. And things like these tubes, which should only be used once and thrown away, we're just using time and time and time again until they fall apart.
Started them in tetracycline.
Rachel Mixer is a nurse from Minneapolis working at the refugee camp at El Fau. Every day, refugees die here from measles, malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition.
I mean, so many of them, they just get this diarrhea and it never gets better. But that's a chronic thing with malnutrition. I mean, malnutrition leads to diarrhea, and diarrhea leads to malnutrition.
The cycle leaves row after row of empty-eyed children with nothing but skeletons for bodies. Children with mothers too weak and too sick to nurse them.
I mean, this at home would be in the intensive care.
Incubator, right?
Yeah. I know, 2 weeks, and he's already like this. It's pretty bad.
These are rough days for Rachel. The work is endless, the living conditions difficult. And it is worse, much worse than she ever imagined.
Mom got sick, I think.
To aid the refugees in the Sudan, a special hotline has been set up and is being manned by volunteers. The line has been swamped with calls for the past 2 days, so they have added extra lines. If you would like to call and help, you can call the African Famine Relief Hotline. The number is 612-888-3119. Collect calls will be accepted. Three weeks ago, a disaster relief consultant was hired to help organize the relief effort in eastern Sudan, where hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian refugees are living in camps. Fred Cooney works with a United Nations official there, a man from Minnesota, and together they are making a difference. There are only 3 days of water left at Wad Cowley. This refugee camp on the border between Ethiopia and the Sudan swelled to more than 90,000 people in less than 2 months. And the refugees simply drank the river dry.
The camp needs 1,200 tons of water a day just to fulfill minimum requirements, basically. And it's impossible to truck this. You're talking about 200 trucks a day, even if there were a road which could carry this many trucks, and even if there were this many trucks.
Julian Murray echoes the despair of many relief workers in Sudan. Every week, it seems, they are overwhelmed by a new crisis. Not enough food, not enough water, the outbreak of a new epidemic. And while they wait for decisions from the top, people are dying.
Sierra Golf, this is Fred Cooney speaking, over.
Hello, Fred. This is somebody speaking, over.
Good morning. Can I speak to Mike Manning, please?
This is Mike, over.
Mike, good morning. Fred here. You about ready to go to Wad Cowley?
Fred Cooney is a veteran of 45 international relief efforts and a tough Texas cowboy who was right at home here in the African desert.
This fuel's got all sorts of junk in it.
The United Nations hired Cooney and his company to manage the crisis after increasing criticism that it was responding too slowly to the famine and the refugees. In just 3 weeks, Cooney built airstrips for the plane he shipped from the United States and reassembled in the Sudan. His team of experts set up a computer system to project camp populations and daily food requirements.
Then we're going to create another database that's going to have a donor record. You know, the donor agency, the country they're from, the dates the ships leave the U.S. or Sweden or wherever.
Hi, you got a passenger?
Cooney works with Mike Menning, the United Nations field officer in eastern Sudan. Menning grew up in Monamedi, Minnesota, then joined the Peace Corps and the International Rescue Committee before taking this job. Cooney and Menning now oversee the lives of 350,000 refugees in Sudan. Today, their big problem is how to move 90,000 people out of the camp at Wad Cowley before the water runs out.
The point is we don't want to move them twice.
They must find trucks, the fuel, and then convince a Sudanese official to approve the site for a new camp.
And that's one of the reasons why they're bringing him down here, is to impress on him the need to make the move. And tomorrow, you need to organize your worst-case scenario.
The days and nights are long. The workers, most of them volunteers, are tired and hungry, and there is no way, nowhere to get away from it all. It is a long way from Monamedi, but Mike Menning is inspired by the work.
Well, it's something that needs to be done. It's something I feel like I can make a contribution towards. It's not a great place to work, but it is something where you can have an impact, and you can make a contribution that hopefully will relieve some of the suffering. My satisfaction is just helping them.
Yeah, this one's okay. Come here.
Fred Cooney is no longer sentimental, but he hasn't lost his soft spot, and it gets touched every time he tours the camp and sees the children. Fred Cooney says he never cries, he just gets mad.
You know, we're always dealing with a problem. We're not really dealing with the solutions. We're not able to get ahead of these situations. You know, this should never happen. It's you know, I think it always bothers me is, you know, people get really caught up in these really stupid little political wars. Regional divisions, tribal divisions, and, you know, a few people making political decisions that result in thousands of other people being displaced and dying in godforsaken places like this.
And Fred Cooney wonders when the world will start looking for the real solutions, so people like him won't have impossible problems to solve, like moving 90,000 people from Wad Cowley before the water runs out.
We can make a difference in that drought-stricken region. A small amount of money can buy a fairly substantial amount of food for the refugees. If you would like to help, you can call for information to the African Famine Relief Hotline that has been established. That number is 612-888-3119. Refugees from Ethiopia, Chad, and Uganda are pouring into the Sudan to escape this famine. But the Sudan is also suffering. There is drought there, too, and people are starving.
They are refugees in their own country. Sudanese farmers driven off their land by drought, now living on handouts at a relief camp 20 miles outside Khartoum. There is chaos in this camp. Children fight for bread. Whips are used to keep people in order. We are told many of these people were once wealthy farmers, village elders, reduced by famine to crippled old men trying desperately to maintain their dignity as strangers watch them suffer.
If the drought continues longer than another year or so, well, even if it continues to the end of this year, we're going to have tremendous displacements of people in Sudan. The small villages are not going to be able to maintain their lifestyle. They're not going to be able to develop any kind of economy.
He did plant this. Yeah. And this is what happened? Nothing. It's just dry.
There is a paleness under his dark skin. He is very thin and getting weaker. For 2 years, there has been no harvest on his land. Last month, he sold his livestock to buy food for the children. The cattle, too weak to make it to the market, have all starved to death. The choice, he said, was to feed my animals or my sons.
We trust in God. We just trust in God. We cannot do anything if there is no rain.
Mohammed is 60 years old. Because he sold his plows and oxen, when he plants next year, he will do it all by hand. It will take him 6 weeks to plant the seed this way. At night, he will leave the field exhausted, go home, and pray for rain.
So we divided up into 3 areas and measured children in all the settlements.
At another village in eastern Sudan, Emily Copeland has just completed a nutrition study. There are 122 children in the village. Over 7% of them are malnourished. The rest of the children are borderline.
But if they don't get food rations, you're going to have a lot of children dropping into the severely malnourished category, and you're going to have even more of a crisis on your hands when it's too late to do anything about it.
Some relief officials are predicting that by next year, Sudan, once considered the breadbasket of Africa, will be in worse shape than Ethiopia. And the situation grows worse as refugees continue to flood the country from almost every border. In 3 months, 400,000 refugees from Ethiopia, Chad, and Uganda have come here looking for food.
I think that the previous exemplary tolerance with refugees is being tried at the moment by this. The Sudan is also suffering from the same famine and the same drought as the rest of the Sahel. And I just hope that this particular influx is not the straw which breaks the camel's back.
The village of Gerba is located near a reservoir in eastern Sudan. There is plenty of water here. The village economy is better than in most places. But yesterday, Ethiopian refugees began arriving in trucks. 10,000 refugees will eventually be settled here.
Are they afraid that their resources are limited here in the town and that the refugees might hurt that situation?
Yeah, to some extent. They think that the resources are limited. In the same time, they are not so angry.
Publicly, the villagers welcome the refugees, but privately they fear that food and water may soon run out, that the land will be further stripped of its trees by refugees looking for firewood.
Big problem is, of course, nobody wants to have a refugee camp next door to them. The village officials don't want it, so no one really wants a refugee camp. Would you like to have 100,000 refugees living next to you in Minneapolis? Probably not.
We asked Mohammed, the Sudanese farmer, what he thought about the refugees. "I am sorry we have no crops," he told us, "or perhaps I could give some of them jobs." He worries about their future and his own. If there are no crops next year, what will he do?
A hotline has been established for people looking for ways to help ease the suffering in East Africa. Volunteers report they are receiving an average of about 24 calls an hour. If you would like to find out how you can help, you may phone them at 612-888-3119. Tonight we conclude our series of reports on the famine in Africa with a personal account of how the story and the people affected me and the 3 people who accompanied me on this trip. Producer Mike Myrendorf and photographers Jeff Coffer and Dave Bowden did a very special job on a subject that we all felt it was a privilege to work on.
What are they?
The donkey is starving. You get angry watching these helpless animals struggle. Who could be so cruel? And then someone tells me he was left here on the road to die by a refugee who didn't have enough food or water for himself or his family. Outside the huts where the refugees live, we can hear a woman crying. And we know another child, another sister, another parent has died. We see children die every day. And we watch as their parents bury them. On their faces, I see patience, courage, and also desperation. Their families walk 8 weeks for food and then sit for days with nothing to eat. They wait quietly, all their belongings gathered around them, too weak to complain. I never see anyone push or shove for food, and I think about my own impatience. After seeing all these mothers with their starving children waiting so patiently for 1 cup of milk, a lot of things back home no longer seem to matter. In the camp, refugees with nothing to do all day but sit, hang on to their memories, and tell us about better times. This is the sword Abraham's father gave him. On his farm in Ethiopia, he used it to clear the brush. He is a young man with 3 children and a wife. He tells us he hopes one day to take them home. In another hut in the same camp, Sogonia makes coffee and tells me about her escape from the war and famine in northern Ethiopia. She walked 8 days to the refugee camp at Wad Sharifi. I have no place to go, she says, so I will stay here. And then she asked me for help, and I know there's nothing I can do.
When the water first came in, we were filling one of those big yellow tanks, and the hose came out. And one of the refugees wasn't strong enough to push the hose back in, so I did my idle flint and went bouncing on the tank, water spraying everywhere, and stuck it back in. And all the ones around cheered.
Peter is an engineer with volunteers in service overseas, the British equivalent to the Peace Corps. He is in charge of supplying and setting up the water tanks in this camp. Peter is someone we will remember from this trip, a tough-minded worker with a heart of gold, a beer-drinking sailor who now sits in the desert drinking tea and fighting bureaucrats at the United Nations. In a very rough survey that we did, we found out that over 30% of the children are malnourished. Sister Terry, a nun from Pennsylvania. She worked as a volunteer during the Biafran crisis and was asked to come to Sudan. She talked to me a lot when I felt like crying, and she shared some of her own tears, too.
Well, I walk through places like this and keep saying to myself, why me? Why am I not, why me? Why am I not suffering when you see so many people who are? And I kind of have to pinch myself sometimes to be in touch with that reality.
In the clinic with Sister Terry, we found Gertz Egermont. They call him the Crazy Finn, a young man so frantic to help, he changed his whole life to be here.
So I am a social worker, but then I arrived here as a tourist, and suddenly they say they needed someone to do a survey. They couldn't find anyone. So I said, well, I can stay here for a while, and so I got involved in the whole thing. Totally malnourished.
Your heart breaks as you watch, and your mind rejects what is happening to these children. Children like Hisson, so weak, so worn, he can no longer smile. A 4-year-old boy who suffers the pain of an arthritic old man, unable even to stretch his legs.
We leave here having learned what true despair is really all about. The hell of these camps and the faces of the children dying of starvation will stay with us always. But we will also remember the incredible will to live of these refugees, how they invited us as honored guests into their ragged huts, and having nothing themselves offered us their last bit of food. How they invited us to dance and to sing with them and to celebrate in their lives. And perhaps most importantly, how they taught us to never, no matter what, give up hope.